Okay, everybody. I want to talk a little bit about moral and cultural relativism today. Um, so, as we know, anthropology is composed of the study of culture and human society. The difference between it and sociology is often with its sort of obsession or sort of encapsulation or whatever you want to call it with this idea of culture. And meaning that we have some sense of studying the ideas behind why people behave the way they do, how they think, and sort of why they create the things they do as parts of society beyond sort of technological advancement, and so some of the motivations for things like invention and sort of diffusion and all these other things. So when we think about culture from the classic anthropological, perspective, is always this idea that certain parts of human societies were invented and certain things were invented and then diffused other places. And, a lot of early anthropologists were obsessed with this idea of that these things could be created somewhere and then diffused to other places, and trying to figure out where certain things were created. In fact, contemporary archaeologists still do that. However, I want to sort of stress this idea of cultural relativism and sort of ethnocentrism as ways of understanding sort of how the study of anthropology has developed, specifically how people have gone from just worrying about how things originated to understanding the complex sort of ways in which different social systems work. And so the idea of cultural relativism, which was sort of coined by Franz Boas, and his students, was a way of thinking about cultural contexts, specifically thinking about this idea of historical particularism, which focused on sort of these historical developments of particular societies and taking every society and breaking it down into sort of how it sort of developed along its unique history. And then using that history and sort of that development of social systems and sort of these methods of understanding culture and society to sort of contextualize that in its own framework, to understand that society from its own, sort of judging that society from its own perspectives. And that sort of is the sense of cultural relativism. Now, in the sense of relativism, there is also moral relativism and sort of ethical relativism. Moral relativism is sort of this idea that every society has its own morals and should only be judged by the morals of that society. So, right and wrong can only be determined from the context of a specific society. So when you study a society, for example, that where infanticide may be practice, for example, the killing of children, of infants, because of various, reasons. Maybe it's sickness, maybe it's, they were born a twin, as in some societies where, twins were considered to be evil, or, whatever the case may be. Those sort of moral judgments were supposedly only valid within their own social context, meaning that those from Western society, us going into those societies as anthropologists and doing research there, we were supposed to think in a way where we don't judge that sort of that idea of infanticide as something that's immoral, because within that society it would be moral. And a lot of people stray away from moral relativism for some of those reasons, and that's just an extreme case, but that's an example of what it is. Ethical relativism is similar, where, human, like the ethics of a society is the ways of being a proper person, or being a sort of upholding idea of the ideal citizen, or the ethical, the righteous person, is also contextual. And so when we talk about this idea of cultural relativism, we're talking about sort of the bridge between just understanding the culture within its own context, or even going extreme as moral and ethical relativism. But I just, as an anthropologist, I start to think about sort of this idea of cultural relativism that's specifically focusing on those ideas of, just taking the culture within its own context. You can have judgments and disagreements with that cultural context, but you really understand it within its own context. And, the moral and ethical parts of the issue becomes, it's different for every anthropologist. But one of the general ideas behind, sort of this idea of cultural relativism is that anybody can be judgmental and think about, another particular society as being wrong or backwards or whatever the case may be. But to be able to take that culture within its own context is something that renders us different forms of understanding of how, societies develops and functions. So